If you're struggling to get a punchy and exciting mix, your drums are probably holding you back. Here's how to take them from this to this. By the end of this video, you'll have a clear 9-step system for mixing drums so they always sit perfectly in the mix, and you can apply it on your next track. If you want me to give you feedback on your mixes, productions, or songs, click the first link in the description. Before we touch an EQ or a compressor, there's one thing that will make or break your drum mix. If your drums aren't programmed right, there's no amount of mixing that will make them sound the way you want them to. The first thing to make sure of is that your velocities are right. Having all your drums at the same velocity is a great way to make them sound like a computer. You have to consider how hard a drummer would actually be able to play a part. For example, if you're playing a blast beat with lots of snares, the snares are going to have to be lower velocity because the drummer can't play full velocity on all of those snare hits. At the same time, if you've got a bunch of really fast kicks, you're going to have to lower the velocities. But the drummer might also change the velocities depending on how they want the part to groove. For example, you might have high velocities on the downbeat or low velocities on ghost notes and syncopation. Next is timing. Having gridded drums is fine, everyone does it. But the problem is when two shells are playing at the same time and you have them both exactly the same. For example, if you've got a snare and a tom playing at the same time, you want to make sure the timing is slightly apart so it sounds realistic. And lastly, you want to make sure the playing is actually realistic. Having 64th kicks playing all the time isn't, neither is having 3 cymbals playing at once. So make sure whatever you're programming is actually playable by a drummer and it will sound more realistic. Now that the drum performance feels realistic, we need to make sure the drums themselves sound right, and that starts with pitch. Tuning the drums is extremely important and it can completely change the weight and the feel of the drums. In this example, I'm going to play the same part but with 2 different snare drums. One is pitched high and one is pitched low. Listen to the way it completely changes the weight of the drums. You'll hear the deeper one has more low-end punch, but then the higher one has more smack and attack. The higher snare might be better for more articulate snare parts as well. You can also tune your kick. Generally, lower tuned kicks are better suited for metalcore, but for other genres, you might want to tune it up. Now that we've tuned our drums to match the energy of our song, the next stage is critical. Alignment, phase, and gating might not be the most exciting things, but they're essential to getting a pro drum mix. And don't worry, they're easier than you think. For my mix, I got the kick from the multi-sample instrument, but then I've also got another kick, which is a one-shot sample, and I've done the same thing on snare. So to make sure they're aligned, you can do it by ear, but I think there's a better way. Record both kicks onto different tracks, and then zoom into the waveforms and look for the transient. Then you want to align the big waveform at the start together, and then just check the phase, make sure that they're not cancelling each other out. Once you've aligned the audio, you can take the offset and put it onto a track delay or an align plugin. So that's alignment and phase out the way. But finally, I want to gate my drums just to make sure that the tails aren't too long, especially on toms. The tails can be really long. So what I like to do is I like to gate them all off, which is really easy to do on programmed drums because you don't have all this bleed from the other instruments. Okay, we've got the boring stuff out the way. Now we're going to start to fit our drums into the mix. And the next stage is volume balance. If we don't get this right, there's no way our drums are ever going to sound realistic. For this, we're going to take the drums out of solo now, and we're going to listen to it in context of the guitars and the bass. I like to have my kick just poking through the guitars and the snare a little bit louder than the kick. And then the cymbals, I want to make sure that they're audible over everything, but without washing over the entire mix. Don't worry about getting an exact balance here, we just want it to be close enough because the balance is going to change as we do further things later on. Now we finally get to start messing with some plugins. In this stage, we'll shape the frequency balance of each element so the drums sit perfectly in the mix. We'll start with the kick. So for the kick, we just want the sub low and we want the high end click and not much in between. So what we'll tend to do is we'll just scoop the middle and then take all the mud out of the kind of low mids. And then we'll make sure the low end of the kick isn't getting washed out by the bass and the high end of the kick isn't getting lost into the guitars and the cymbals. For the snare, I'll take a low cut and I'll bring it just underneath where the big main transient of the snare is. Then I'll tend to brighten the snare until I tend to hear all the wires, and then if necessary, I'll cut some of the mud out of the mid-range. This might be rings I don't want, or it might just be the snare is too mid-rangey. It's okay to make the snare quite bright in this stage because we're going to fix that later on. For the hats and cymbals, I want to use a low cut and I want to take out everything up under like 500 or something. So go quite high with it. And then again, I use a filter to cut the mud out. And finally, I'll brighten it to taste. I might also use some dynamic EQ here just to bring down some of the rings in some of the cymbals. For the toms, it's pretty similar to the kick. I want to scoop them and then make sure there's a lot of presence in the top end so they poke through the guitars. And then finally the room track, I kind of just want to cut the mud out. So that might be the low end from the kick, or it might be some mud in the snare. But for my room track, I like to make sure they're pretty mid-range focused. Okay, they're sounding good, but they're still missing some character. Here's where compression comes in. In this stage, we'll use compression to shape the tone and the impact of our drums. For our kick, we want a slow attack and a fast release, and I tend to go no more than 2 or 3 dB the gain reduction there. For our snare, I want a medium attack, maybe somewhere between 5 and 10 milliseconds, and then a medium release of maybe 50 to 100 milliseconds. And then here I'm aiming for perhaps 6 dBs of gain reduction. On our overheads, I want a fast attack, and again, probably around -6 dB gain reduction. The release isn't so important, but I use the SSL channel and I just take it down to the shortest release. And our toms, similar to the snare, on a medium attack, probably taking maybe 3 dBs of gain reduction. And I want to try and tune the release time so they don't have too much sustain on them. Now the drums are starting to get some attack, but they're still a bit dry, right? This is where we'll use reverb in a unique way to put our drums in a real space. So I'll usually use 2 reverbs on my drums. I'll have one which is like a fake room, and I'll send all the kit pieces to there, mostly snare, a little bit of kick, and then just a little bit of the overheads and hats. And for that, I want quite a short tail. Again, I'm trying to make it like a fake room track. And generally all I'll do on this is I'll compress it and then make sure it's blended in with the rest of the drums. Then we have a more standard reverb as well. This will be way more snare focused. This might be up to 2 seconds long, maybe longer on some tracks. Again, I'll compress it. I might distort it a bit. And then with the EQ, I want to cut out a bit of that fundamental frequency of the snare. Now the drums are feeling more live, but we can take them a step further. By using subtle distortion, we can shape the dynamics of our drums to make them really cut through the guitars and bass. To do this, I'll use my favorite distortion plugin, Decapitator. We'll start by putting Decapitator on both the kick and the snare. And then we'll put some compression on the drum bus and put a final decapitator after that. The compression on the drum bus will try and glue the tracks together. We're nearly done, but there's one final step. It's time to fine tune what we've done and then apply the final touches on our drum bus. So for this, I'll make sure my levels are right. I'll make sure the parameters on all my plugins are correct. And then remember what I said about the snare before, how we make it too bright on purpose. Here I'll use dynamic EQ to bring up the snare only in the transient and then make it go down so you don't hear too much of the tail of the snare in the top end. This will make the snare sound way punchier. In this stage, I might put a final EQ on the drum bus just to adjust it to the mix. And then I'll put a clipper to clip down the transients. You don't really want to be able to hear the clipper, but use it to increase your headroom so you can make the track louder later on. And finally, we'll adjust our reverbs. Generally here, it's just adjusting the level of them in relation to the rest of the drums. And then we're done. Let me know if this helps you on your drum mix. I'm offering free one-to-one coaching at the moment, so if you're interested in that, click the link in the description. But that's all I've got for you for now. See you later.